The migration process of taking your data from its current servers and migrating it to the cloud can be a tricky experience. It's a daunting process which can go horribly wrong if not properly managed. JJ Milner from Global Micro is in studio with me to share some of the important considerations when undergoing the process of data migration. JJ, welcome. Now, JJ, the big question these days seems to be around to cloud or not to cloud, especially in a hosted exchange environment. And with exchange migration, does it suit everybody? Because we know there are small to medium companies, we have massive enterprises. Who should be moving to the cloud?
Well, I think mail is probably one of the most obvious applications to move to the cloud, because essentially a large portion of that value chain has been delivered by an IT service provider for you all along. But in order to make sure that if you move your infrastructure from your offices to a data center from a service provider, the first thing you've got to make sure is that you've got the connectivity to do it. And that's the one question that we get from every small business who asks us, can we move to the cloud? Isn't bandwidth a problem?
Yeah.
And the answer is it's not a problem, but it certainly is a factor that you need to take into consideration when you are designing a solution. Make sure you've got enough bandwidth. The technical spec is 16K bandwidth per user. And the caveat is that it's the upload speed that's important. So it doesn't matter if you've got a 10 meg or a 40 meg ADSL line. If you've got 30 people at the end of that line and they all need to send their mail up to the service provider in order to send it to the person next to them, you need to multiply 16K by the number of users, and that will tell you if you've got enough bandwidth. So anyone can afford it, but you need to make sure you've got it.
Now, security is also another concern, especially if you deal with organizations such as auditing firms and banks. How do you deal with companies who sit with sensitive information, who perhaps thinking, public cloud, not for me, private cloud, and I'm even going to manage internally?
It's a multifaceted problem. The first thing is you've got to find a service provider that you trust.
That's where that SLA comes in.
Well, the SLA is more around the service delivery, not whether or not they're going to hand your data to someone
whether
from a
they're
marketing
reputable
perspective.
or not, yes.
So pick someone with a good reputation, with a track record. Talk to their customers when you're choosing someone. But over and above that, there are aspects around where your data is actually stored, and the question of data sovereignty comes up. Being able to protect your rights in the cloud is as important to know the law that affects your data. Whether you choose one service provider or another doesn't really matter, but being able to enforce and protect those rights is what you need to consider. So let's say, for example, you put your data in the EU. Would a South African business even know how to log a formal complaint to protect their data if their data was
if something
went wrong? Whereas the South African environment is at least familiar. Whether or not the laws are better or not, that's a whole other question. But at least you're dealing with your own common ground. You can contract with your service provider on South African legal terms, as opposed to a standard form agreement that might be provided by a global player. And then at least you know how to enforce and protect your rights. So that's sort of the legal framework question. But over and above that, there are the basics. Who's controlling the passwords? Are you auditing the environment? Are all changes logged? Is it somehow linked back to your on-premise infrastructure if you're running Active Directory on-premise? Maybe you want to delegate the authority of those passwords back to your environment. This is for large organizations, say 1,000 seats and up. Or do you simply want to have a password sync in both directions that you can reset if a staff member moves? So there are a few of those sort of aspects. And then a hot topic at the moment is cloud encryption, where you would have some sort of cloud appliance that sits on the edge of your network, a proxy if you will, and all the data leaving your environment and going up to the service provider would then be encrypted. And the only way to access it is if you have access to that proxy. So if you have multi-factor authentication against that proxy, you can then be sure that the service provider, no matter how big, no matter how unscrupulous, can't actually see your data. That comes at a bit of a premium, but for industries that require that kind of encryption.
Especially if you're sitting with client information.
If you're dealing with client information, it becomes important.
Let's take a look at the actual migration process. Now, email is not email anymore. It's stored on your desktop, on your laptop, but it's also stored on your smartphone these days. And we know a lot of corporate companies have things like BlackBerry coming in, bring your own device. How does the migration process work when it's a balance between the smartphone devices and what you actually have in your office infrastructure?
Well, I don't think the device really matters anymore. We think about a mailbox as a calendar, your tasks, your inbox, and your shared folders. Now, what device you consume that on doesn't really matter to the cloud provider, because we will surface that information to the appropriate device and render it in that form factor. So the thing to consider when you're migrating is how do you get the data off the original system in a way that will be seamless to the end user. And everyone thinks a mail migration simple and we'll just pick a day and we'll decide we're going to cut over on Friday. Everyone will have no mail for 20 minutes and we'll cut over. The reality is there's a large amount of data. So you've got to first get it out of the existing system. You've then got to manipulate that data so that the internal addresses get rewritten to the new addresses. Anyone who's ever exported their PST, moved to a new provider, and then replied to an old calendar appointment knows that your public mail address, your SMTP address, is not the same as the internal address of the server. And so none of your recurring appointments will occur. Can you imagine having to go through your calendar?
It's a PA's nightmare.
and re-invite everybody and get all of those internal contacts working. So you have to be able to rewrite that information from whatever the source system is, whether it be an Exchange system, whether it be Google Apps, whether it be 365, it doesn't really matter. We do about 5,000 users a week today.
Yeah.
And the number one thing that people are worried about is their calendars and contacts, not the mail, because there are low-tech options for exporting the mail to some sort of offline medium.
Yeah.
But the second issue comes back to the bandwidth question, is if you have a large number of users or larger number of users, well, let me rephrase it. If you're on the edge of that 16K limit that we spoke about, your normal day-to-day use of mail would be fine. But if I go and fetch 25 gigs of mail from maybe Google Apps and move it to hosted Exchange, you've got to re-download that for 10 or 20 users, and that will kill your line. So you need to be able to stage that information and say over a 60-day period, gradually trickle it back down to the users, and so that you don't hurt their line when you're migrating. And when you're fetching the mail, some service providers have throttling policies, so you can't fetch it. So don't leave your migration till a week before your contract expires.
We're literally running out of time, and my last question to you, JJ, is how important is pre-planning and planning through this process?
If you plan it and you make sure that everyone in your team is kept abreast of what you've agreed to, this is not difficult. You can move 25 users a day per tech resource you have on site. We do it all the time, it's seamless, and it won't break the bandwidth.